We are in a revolution. But it is a revolution in which the side that fires the first shot loses. We will not fire any shots because our weapon is uncommon good sense.
Hello and welcome to Tractor Time. Tractor Time is brought to you by Barn to Door and Acres USA, the voice of eco-agriculture. I'm your host, Ben Trollinger, editor of Acres USA magazine. On this episode, we welcome back investigative journalist Carey Gillam. For regular listeners, Carey's a familiar name. This year, she's been joining us each month for a segment we call Industrial Ag Watch, where she keeps us updated on the fearless reporting she does on our industrialized food system. On this episode, we're setting aside more time to really dig into her latest book, The Monsanto Papers: Deadly Secrets, Corporate Corruption, and One Man's Search for Justice. That book is out now, and you can find it at the acresusa.com bookstore. Carey's also the author of the 2017 book, Whitewash, the story of a weed killer, cancer, and the corruption of science. Whitewash won the coveted Rachel Carson Book Award from the Society of Environmental Journalists, and you can also go back in the archives and listen to a 2019 podcast we did with Carey about that book. Carey also works as a reporter and director of research for U.S. Right to Know. Her work frequently appears in The Guardian, and she has more than 30 years of experience covering food and agricultural policies and practices. She also serves on the Freedom of Information Task Force for the Society of Environmental Journalists. I'm thrilled to share this interview with you today, but before that, we're going to check in with the fine folks at the Rodale Institute. Welcome to a monthly segment we're calling Transition Land. It's a collaboration with the Rodale Institute, and we're focusing on helping conventional farmers transition to regenerative organic practices. On this episode, Christy Wendelberger joins us to go deeper into the soil-nourishing benefits of cover crops. Welcome back, Christy.
Thank you. It's always great to be here.
So we've been talking a lot these days about cover crops and keeping roots in the ground. And I think we have this idea that plants take, they absorb water, minerals, but they also give back. There's this real give and take between plants and soil. Talk a little bit about how that works.
Well, there is a very big give back that plants, they aren't just, if you think about a forest, a forest is a system that is constantly turning over, but yet it continues. So they have to be giving something if that soil is going to continue supporting other plants. And so it's the same concept when you're farming. The more diverse you make your field, the more that those plants can give back in different ways. So one of the things that plants really can do for the soil itself and just kind of the structure of the soil is really help with compaction. With a cover crop, you generally plant it denser than you would most of your cash crops. Mm-hmm. And so the roots themselves will become more dense than the cash crops. And so those roots, they'll penetrate into the soil, and they can penetrate into deeper, more compact zones than a regular cash crop would. Often they can do that. So they'll penetrate the soil and go deeper and really kind of just break it up. And as they're doing that, they're creating these very small tunnels throughout the whole soil structure.
So this is kind of nature's way of plowing.
Exactly. It is exactly nature's way of plowing. And so they're creating these tunnels. And there's lots of things that happen within these tunnels. And one of the things that happens is it's just less compact soil. And we all know that when you put plants into less compact soil, they can put their roots out easier, and it makes the cash crop be able to grow bigger and stronger, and then hopefully have better yields. But it also, those pathways that the roots produce after the cover crop has been terminated and the roots die off, it leaves these little tunnels, and that helps with infiltration as well. So water can then penetrate into the soil faster and deeper than it would be able to if it didn't have these cover crops. It's not uncommon to see places where there's good cover crop management, and and there's a big rainstorm and there's no flooding. But then the farm right next door doesn't use cover crops, and there's a big rainstorm and there's flooding. So one of the variables there is the fact that it's helping with the infiltration in the soil.
And it's not just about creating better soil structure. It's also about using this process of photosynthesis to feed simple sugars into the soil, or exudates would be another way of saying it. Talk a little bit about how that works and how important that is to soil health.
Yeah, exactly. Soil health, one of the things that makes a really healthy soil is having a healthy microbiome. So you want to have a lot of microbial community, a big microbial community in the soil. You want there to be a lot of bacteria, a lot of mycorrhizae, which is a fungus. You want, you just want a lot of diversity in terms of the microbial community. In order to get that, they need, just like anything else, they also need nutrients. So when photosynthesis happens, the plants pull carbon dioxide out of and add in oxygen, carbon dioxide and water into the plant. They use light, and then they make nutrients for themselves. But also those nutrients go down into the roots, and some of them are exuded as amino acids, as organic acids, as other nutrients that can be used by these microorganisms. And an example is these exudates can stimulate that process of rhizobia coming into the roots and producing nodules that people know of for nitrogen fixing plants like legumes, mycorrhizae that come into the plant, and a lot of times mycorrhizae will infiltrate the plant, and then they are very tiny, tinier than the roots themselves, so they can penetrate even deeper into the soil and pull up more nutrients and more water for the plant. So the plants give the mycorrhizae nutrients, and the new mycorrhizae give that back by giving them some nutrients. And so having that structure in the ground so that you can promote this microbial community is really important.
And what are some of the strategies that farmers are using in terms of cover cropping that is aimed toward creating certain soil conditions? Do you see farmers using cover crops in a very diverse way? What are the tactics that they're using? What are the go-to cover crops?
Yeah, I think instead of getting into kind of the details of each species they're using, I think you can think of it more on an ecological perspective. So when you have more diversity, you tend to have healthier habitats. And so it's the same thing in terms of root structure. Different plants create different root structures. So some plants have a taproot, like daikon radishes. They have a taproot, goes straight down. Some plants have more fibrous roots, like maybe a cereal rye, and their roots go wider and shallower than maybe the daikon radish would. Some kind of do a little bit of both, where they go deep but also wide. And so really picking what a lot of farmers are doing now is picking a diverse community of cover crops. So it's not just one cover crop, but they'll have 2 or 3 or 6 different cover crops, depending on what they're looking to do. If they have very compact soil, they may have more cover crops. If they have, or more diverse cover crops, to get those different soil roots penetrating at different levels and in different ways. And so having a diversity in cover crops will help with the compaction, because your root system is so much more diverse, and help with the infiltration, and also create just more of those tunnels that, is again the infiltration and the compaction. But in those tunnels is also where those exudates are given off. And so those tunnels will have more oxygen than the surrounding soil, and they'll have more nutrients in them from the exudates. So those tunnels are habitats for the microbial community, and they will get basically they just become these little, it's an underground homes for the microbial community. And so the more diversity you have, you tend to produce more habitat for the microbes.
Can you think of a case study that illustrates what you're talking about? In other words, maybe a Rodale Institute project or a farmer project that you're aware of where they did a certain mix of cover crops with a particular result in mind?
Well, I mean, here at the Southeast Organic Center, we have a project going on right now that we don't have results for yet, but that is what the purpose to the project is. And so in a collaboration with Clemson University, we have a USDA Organic Transitions funded project. And Clemson has the same project that they're doing on their property in the coastal plain. So it's more sandy down there. And we have our project that we're doing in the Piedmont. So we're going to be able to compare what's happening in the coastal plain versus what's happening in the Piedmont soils. And we're looking at hairy vetch and cereal rye, and then just putting chicken manure down, and then all the combinations of those three. So hairy vetch and cereal rye and hairy vetch and chicken manure, all those combinations. And the impact of different, of conventional tillage, where you just disc in these cover crops versus just rolling it, like we talk about a lot at Rodale, using a roller crimper and then just rolling it and doing no-till. And so the idea is we've collected soil samples from 0 centimeters down to 60 centimeters, stratified them every 15 centimeters. And then we're looking at how those different cover crops are impacting the nutrients and the microbial community and compaction and infiltration and bulk density of both our property as well as at Clemson. So, this is the type of research and the type of stuff that farmers do all the time. They're just not doing it with this, stratified split block design that's perfect. But, it's just taking your soils and the different soils that you're farming on and putting down different combinations and seeing what helps you the most. And we're going to be able to quantify it, which most farmers would quantify that based on yield, but we'll be able to also quantify that based on what the microbial community is doing and the nutrient levels in the soil are.
The dream within organic regenerative agriculture is to create closed systems that can really cycle fertility for long periods of time. It's kind of the perpetual motion machine of agriculture. But I guess my question is, how far can you push cover crops in reducing outside inputs that you're bringing onto your farm?
The reality is it depends. It depends on where your soil is at in the moment when you're starting. Where are you starting this? Are they super depleted, or are they already in pretty good shape and you just want to keep them in good shape? If they're super depleted, you can do a lot for decreasing the amount of inputs you put into the soil. If they're already in really good shape, you can do a lot to maintain that and keep them in good shape using cover crops. There's still research that's being done on how, for example, corn it takes nitrogen heavy twice during the year, during its growth period. So, how do you use cover crops to be able to reduce the amount of nutrients that you have to put in? So some people are even interseeding cover crops into the corn. So they grow the corn, grow it about a foot tall, and then interseed it with something else that may be a legume, something that it'll grow. And then as the corn grows and shades it out, it's going to start providing nutrients to the soil. So again, it depends on where you start, what your objective is, and what you're growing will depend on if you can go to completely nothing. The idea is to try to figure out a way to do it where there is no inputs are needed other than, maybe compost or something that is simple and organic.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Christy.
All right. Thank you.
Christy Wendelberger is the research director for the Rodale Institute Southeast Organic Center in Chattahoochee Hills, Georgia. She's responsible for expanding organic farming practices throughout the Southeast through research, outreach, and education. Learn more about the Rodale Institute at rodaleinstitute.org. I want to take this moment to introduce our sponsor, Barn to Door. They're doing a new segment aimed at helping farmers, and you'll hear that later in this episode. But who are they? Barn to Door powers farmers who sell direct, helping them increase sales, access customers, and save time. They help farmers meet buyers' expectations through easy ordering and an accessible brand across online channels. Farmers use software, services, and resources from Barn to Door to manage and promote their business. The bottom line is this: farms that provide convenient buying and delivery options reach more buyers. Data show farmers can double revenue when they offer online subscriptions and direct delivery. Promote your brand, manage your orders, and keep your profits with Barn to Door, providing the capabilities and support you need to build a thriving farm direct business. Learn more at barntodoor.com/Tractor Time. We're really happy to have Carey Gillam back on the podcast. The work she's doing right now is invaluable and, dare I say, brave. When we think of investigative journalists, we might think about Woodward and Bernstein. We might think about the Washington Post or the New York Times. But increasingly, if you want to find journalism that holds powerful corporations and governments accountable, you have to look beyond mainstream sources. As I mentioned earlier, Carey does a lot of work for U.S. Right to Know. It's a nonprofit news site that you should check out and consider supporting if you value independent journalism. If you're interested in hearing more, listen through to the end of the interview when Carey and I talk about the mission of U.S. Right to Know. The main focus of this interview, however, is the landmark lawsuits taking Monsanto to task over the disturbing health effects of its best-selling herbicide, Roundup. Carey's new book tells the harrowing story of Lee Johnson, a school district groundskeeper with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma who won a historic $280 million judgment against Monsanto in 2018. The book is part legal thriller and part battle cry for environmental justice. I hope you find this interview as illuminating and galvanizing as I did. Hello, Carey. Welcome back.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Monsanto has a long history that stretches back over 100 years. How did a small Missouri-based saccharin company turn into this global behemoth worth billions?
Yeah, they were started in 1901, by this guy named John Queeny, named the company after his wife. That was Monsanto was her maiden name. They started as a maker of this artificial sweetener, and then they expanded into sort of an industrial, chemical supplier, and got involved in a whole array of different chemicals and PCBs and DDT. Monsanto was one of the companies that was helping the government as a supplier of Agent Orange, which was used in the Vietnam War as a defoliant. By our troops to try to keep the enemy from hiding in lush overgrowth. So the company, though, after the war, like many other chemical companies at that time, they were looking for, what is our next big market? What do we do next? And agriculture was really, the new frontier for these chemical companies, and the products that they had been pushing for industrial use and for use in wartime could be repurposed, so to speak, for use by farmers. And glyphosate, Monsanto was looking, for what to do with different chemicals and how to really break into this market. And they had a scientist who was looking at this chemical called glyphosate that really nobody had looked at it before as a weed killer. It had actually changed hands a few times with different companies unable to determine, something that would be profitable to do with it. And their scientists found out that it made a heck of a weed killer. And he actually, came to win several awards for this. And, glyphosate was a remarkable new find because it killed weeds so effectively, efficiently, a whole array of different types of weeds. It was considered so much more effective and so much safer than other weed killers that farmers had been, dabbling with or using for years before glyphosate came on the market. And this really pushed Monsanto to prominence. This glyphosate product that most people know as Roundup. Glyphosate herbicides have, come in hundreds of different brand names now, but Roundup is probably the one that is best known. And they brought this to market in the 1970s and really haven't looked back, since. This evolved into a multi-billion-dollar product. Monsanto introduced genetically engineered crops, of course, to tolerate the use of these glyphosate herbicides, and grew to be about a $15 billion in revenue company, selling these genetically altered seeds and Roundup herbicides. And then, of course, they were purchased by the big German company Bayer in 2018 and live on as a unit of Bayer now.
And how long have you been covering Monsanto? How did they first come on to your radar as a journalist?
Well, I started covering Monsanto in 1998, which sounds like a really, really long time ago. Feels like a long time ago, too, I suppose. I was a banking reporter living in Atlanta, Georgia, working for a company called Thomson Financial. Thomson actually eventually acquired Reuters, but before they did, I was working for Thomson, as I said, writing about very big banking companies. And Reuters lured me away and asked me to move to Kansas and start writing about this really cool company that had just introduced genetically engineered seeds. This was again, 1998. And so it was my job to come to Kansas and start learning everything I could about food and farming and, what agriculture meant as an industry, both to sort of U.S. trade and the U.S. economy, as well as to our own health and environmental health. Covered commodity trading as well to understand, the cash and the futures markets, and really spent, lots and lots of time. I really have been through hundreds and hundreds of farm fields and met farmers all across the country learning about their business. I spent a lot of time in Monsanto headquarters in the St. Louis area, and Dow, DuPont, and Syngenta, and BASF, and all those players who were becoming big in seeds and chemicals for farming, because I worked for Reuters, wanted to woo me, wanted to bring me into their offices and teach me the business from their perspective. So, it really was a great education. And, it's all I've done ever since, really is cover this industry.
Right. And you wrote a book about it called Whitewash. It was highly regarded, award winning. And, the new book that we're discussing today, the Monsanto Papers, takes a very different approach. Could you give us a brief description of Whitewash and what the sort of approach there was?
Yeah, Whitewash surprised me as well. I think I had been working for Reuters, for all these years, writing about agriculture and food and farming. And as I learned more, both from the companies and from outside experts, academics, weed scientists, soil scientists, farmers, grain handlers. I really explored the whole gamut to try to understand this industry. I came to see really clearly that there were some really important issues that were being hidden. The truth was not necessarily being told about the dangers of glyphosate in particular, and primarily because it was pushed to such widespread use by Monsanto and through this avenue of genetically engineered crop technology. Glyphosate use exploded during the time I was covering it, grew to become the world's most widely used weed killer. And scientists were looking at this and finding that it was becoming ubiquitous. It was being found in air samples and rainfall and, groundwater, drinking water, in a whole array of foods that we were consuming. And they were very concerned about what it was doing to our health. They were seeing impacts on pollinators and other elements of wildlife that were harmful. But all of that was really being hidden by Monsanto and the other companies in the industry. And so this book, Whitewash, really just laid that all out. It didn't say glyphosate should be banned by any means, but it said there's a lot of science that shows that this heavy use of this chemical is really bad for our environment and for our health, that perhaps we need a more balanced risk assessment and risk reward analysis. And I guess the book to me it looks at the science, it looks at, the impact on the food industry, it looks at the relationship between the company and the EPA, and it looks at a lot of people who were getting cancer that was associated with their exposure to this chemical. So the book was described as an expose. It did win 3 awards. It had me invited to speak all over the world about the findings. But it was pretty much a heavy read, I think.
Yeah.
A lot of science in that book. The new book is quite different, I think.
It is different, and it's kind of a thriller. It's a legal thriller, and it's also kind of a David and Goliath story. And obviously Monsanto is the Goliath in this latest book, but who is the David in the story?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess the most obvious character as a David is Lee Johnson, this man who we follow through the book. He's just a middle-aged guy, kind of your average Joe. He hasn't had the easiest life. He's in his 40s. He's got 2 young kids and a wife, and he works as a school groundskeeper for the Benicia, California School District. And part of his job is to spray the grounds to treat weeds, to try to keep them free of weeds and unwanted vegetation. And he uses these Monsanto products to do that. And he's using them in large quantities. And I really wanted this to be a human story. I wanted people to understand his experience. And so I spent a lot of time with him. And, you start out with him in his apartment and, getting ready to go to work and that sort of thing. So he very clearly is the David. He comes to develop a form of non-Hodgkin lymphoma that is designated to be terminal. The doctors tell him he's got less than 2 years to live, which is devastating news, obviously, to the father of 2 young boys, as it would be to anybody. And how he then sort of connects with this team of really sort of eclectic, and I found them very sort of oddly interesting lawyers who also are the Davids to a certain extent in this story.
And Lee was, as a groundskeeper, was really careful with how he used Roundup, even though it was marketed as being the safest weed killer out there. Lee was really wary of using it, and yet at the same time, he had these accidents, and in very short order, he started having really serious health problems. That is it's really heartrending to read about.
Yeah, I mean, to understand what Lee has been going through is just it was heartbreaking to report this story, to spend so much time with him, to see how he has been suffering was just really a pull on my heart. And I wanted readers to understand that, because I think much as glyphosate or Roundup represents a problem we have with pesticide use in this country, I think Lee's story represents what a lot of far too many people are suffering, in terms of cancer. We have close to 40% of people living in the U.S. who are Cancer Society tells us are expected to get cancer in their lifetimes. 40% of men and women are expected to get cancer in their lifetimes, and that it's just not the way it should be, I don't think. But Lee's story, I hope, resonates with people and is a powerful tale of how one person, has followed that journey and tried to fight back against both cancer and the company that he blamed for causing his cancer.
Yeah, and Lee isn't the only plaintiff to take on Monsanto. I mean, there are thousands who have similar stories, and what do they all have in common?
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, there are over 100,000 people in the U.S. who have sued Monsanto, and they all allege that they developed non-Hodgkin lymphoma because of their exposure to Monsanto's glyphosate herbicides, Roundup or Ranger Pro or other brand names. So that is the commonality. Of course, there are many different types of non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and these people all had different usage patterns and different experiences. And some used it in their jobs, and like Lee, and then others used it around their properties, their homes, or things like that. And many of the plaintiffs in the litigation have died, and their cases are being carried on by family members or spouses, things like that, children. It is very widespread. It's one of the largest mass torts in the United States. And many people, I guess if you follow this, would know that Bayer, which again bought Monsanto in 2018, has been trying to settle the cases. They lost Lee's trial and two other trials, 3 of 3 that have been held so far. They lost all 3. And they have been trying desperately to settle these cases and, of course, to make them go away.
A World Health Organization body in, I think, 2015 declared that glyphosate is a probable carcinogen, and that was a big milestone, but it really just set off this huge whirlwind. I mean, it was controversial because Monsanto disagreed with it, but also because it set the stage for this litigation that you're describing. Talk about why the WHO did that and what they were saying about glyphosate's potential impact on human health.
Yeah, so the World Health Organization has this agency or this unit called the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC. We call it IARC. And what IARC does is essentially look at, commonly used substances, things that people are exposed to a lot. And it's their job to look at the science, the literature that is out there, published peer-reviewed evidence, and review it and see if there's a cancer risk associated, if there's a hazard, if this could potentially cause cancer. And then they're not a regulator, but their information then can be used and is respected and regarded and looked to by regulators all over the world. State regulators as well as federal regulators. And they've always been considered really sort of the gold standard. The members who come together to review literature on a substance are independent scientists. They are specialists in cancer science, and are, again, considered some of the most highly regarded cancer scientists around the world. So in 2014, they were looking, what are we going to review next? And glyphosate was suggested to them because of the widespread use and because there had been a number of studies published over the last several years showing, this looks like it might cause cancer. There's some genotoxicity concerns. There are all these different studies that are coming together looking at both toxicology and animal studies and some epidemiology. And even some, in the laboratory cellular tests that show this could cause cancer. So we should look at it. And they did. And they determined in March of 2015, they issued a statement showing that they had classified it based on their review of all of these published peer-reviewed studies, that it was a probable human carcinogen. And there was a particularly positive association for non-Hodgkin lymphoma. They also found or said that the literature showed that heavy use of Roundup could be linked to other things like infertility, kidney disease, other cancers. And I talked to many of these scientists, they didn't really think this was a big deal. I mean, they do this kind of all the time. They issue these classifications. And, the nerds out in the world take note, right, and pay attention, but really no one else does usually. But, this exploded in their faces, really, because Monsanto, we saw from internal documents that came out through the litigation, was preparing an attack plan before the group even issued their final decision. Monsanto talked internally about they knew that this group probably would find that there was a cancer connection. They said we should prepare for a possible or probable carcinogen rating. And what are we going to do about it? And we're going to create outcry against this group. And they had a spreadsheet and a whole long plan put together about how they could attack and harass and discredit these group of scientists. And they implemented that immediately after this announcement by this group.
I don't think I'm the first to point out that the new book reads a lot like a John Grisham thriller. It's a really revealing look at civil litigation, but unlike a Grisham novel, there isn't just a lone hero standing up against the odds. These plaintiffs' attorneys are really an imposing cast of characters. They're like this super group of lawyers, like they're like the Avengers, but they definitely took notice of this WHO announcement and started building cases. Talk a little bit about that. How this litigation came to be. What were these lawyers taking notice of?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, Mike Miller was really sort of one of the first, if not the first, He's a good old guy living in Virginia, had been a lawyer forever, 40 some years, and was sort of nearing retirement, but really having a hard time letting it go. And he had made his millions really in pharmaceutical work and holding accountable through the courts companies that made defective medical devices or peddled pills and products that turned out to be quite harmful to people. So that was his specialty. So he knew that there was real importance in sort of keeping an eye on what these scientists with the World Health Organization said, because they would review all of this literature. Of course, a lawyer didn't have time to do that. But so he and his team saw that this announcement come down and immediately started thinking, we need to dig into this because, gosh, this is such a widely used product and so many people, residential users look at this as well as farmers and others. So they started doing work and came to determine that there was enough there that maybe they should try to take Monsanto to court. And they had never filed a suit against a pesticide company. They didn't really know what they were facing with Monsanto. They came to realize that this was, a foe with strength and power and tactics that they had not really experienced before. But they then were the first to file litigation against Monsanto and to begin discovery, which is this obtaining of these internal Monsanto documents as part of evidence gathering.
And the way that they put together these cases is really fascinating. I mean, they're not just taking in anyone who potentially has been impacted by Roundup or glyphosate. They frame the case very specifically around a certain criteria. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that played out?
Yeah, I mean, they wanted to be very specific. They, from the outset, they wanted to have cases that would hold up, and they didn't want to get distracted. They didn't want to be filing cases for people who had things that they couldn't, that there wasn't robust scientific evidence to support, because of course there are a lot of different things mentioned in literature, and like IARC talked about, there or infertility or kidney disease or those sorts of things. But the strongest evidence really was around this non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And so that's what they limited it to. And they really wanted to make sure that they were only taking in plaintiffs, who didn't have a lot of exposure to other sorts of chemicals or other sorts of risk factors in their background. They really wanted cases that they considered to be solid. And the thing that I learned about all this, you're right, like I became fascinated by the legal strategies and the way that these lawyers had to put these cases together and the hills that they climb and the strategies that they employ and some of the sort of, I don't want to say sneaky because it's not sneaky, I guess it's strategic, but it's not just as clean and easy as maybe you think if you watch Law and Order or something like that. I mean, right. So I became fascinated by the legal process, and I tried to share that with the readers in this book, sort of the ins and outs and the good, the bad, the ugly of how the legal sausage gets made, I guess.
We're going to hit pause on this interview for a brief segment from our sponsor, Barn to Door.
Hey, this is Sebastian from Barn to Door. In this week's Farmer Spotlight, we have Amy and Will from Old Rich Valley Farm in Smith County, Virginia. We asked them what their experience has been like using Barn to Door to sell directly to their customers. Here's what they had to say.
We live in a pretty rural part of the country. We're out here in the middle of nowhere, really. And so we have the ability to produce a lot of food, but there's not all that many people around. So I guess from our end, if we're going to produce food, it's all for nothing if you don't have somebody to get it to. And so the online has really gave us an opportunity to reach people that we couldn't have otherwise. So we're kind of thankful for the technology and Barn to Door, for being able to kind of link us to customers, because without that, we'd be in trouble.
The ordering through Barn to Door, and especially the subscriptions, is just been such a blessing. And that is something that we definitely could not have done without Barn to Door, without the online bookstore, because it is just so easy for the customers to go in there and they can choose which subscription they want. They choose their pickup location or their delivery drop, and then their payments go through automatically. So they really don't have to think about it or worry about it for a year. And then I get the list printed out of who needs what every month, and it just makes it a whole lot simpler. And like we said before, the orders were coming in through Facebook and emails and texts and calls, and they were just coming in everywhere. And so it was just really hard to keep up with.
If you'd like to hear more from Amy and Will, you can go to barntodoor.com/tractortime. Thanks for listening.
And you write in the book that some people see these attorneys as predatory. I think in one case, these attorneys refer to their clients as inventory, or maybe it's their cases that they refer to as inventory. And many of them get very rich, as you mentioned, taking on these larger companies. And yet, I guess my question is, what is the alternative? Government regulators appear hesitant, hamstrung to do their job. What's going on here? What does it say about our regulatory system?
That's a great point. And I did come to understand a lot, that there are a lot of layers to that. And I think this whole plaintiff's bar gets painted often with this broad brush by critics as sort of predatory, ambulance chasers, exploitive. And what I found is that within the plaintiff's bar, and you may refer to them as personal injury attorneys, that sort of thing, class action, plaintiff's bar, there are different degrees. And so many of the lawyers who were involved in leading the Roundup litigation look upon with great scorn other plaintiffs' attorneys that they consider to be predatory. So there are lawyers who, like the Miller firm, who come together and with maybe 2 or 3 other firms to lead this sort of litigation, and literally have to write checks, for millions and millions of dollars to pay for the document discovery, analysis of that, expert witnesses, depositions, years of pre-trial work before they ever even, get to present a case to the jury. They have millions of dollars on the line. A lot of them are mortgaging their homes or property, or taking out loans, or bringing in investors, or that sort of thing. And of course, if they lose big. They don't get paid by the clients. They only get paid. I mean, they do if they win, but
right.
But this is not something that is for the faint of heart, I suppose. And then there are a number of attorneys and law firms who sort of take in inventory, take in their clients, and then just sort of sit on that inventory until there is a settlement. And then, we'll stick their hand out and say, okay, we're ready for our settlement dollars now. So, there's a lot of that going on. But to your point, and the point I make in the book is, without regulators that are going to do their jobs and hold these companies to account and be more engaged in protecting public health, we really don't have any other system. And you've seen this time and time again in, whether it be, malfunctioning airbags, or, opioid issues, or medical devices, or Roundup. Without these lawyers to bring everybody into court and to lay the evidence out for all to see, these companies, are never really held to account.
Well, specifically, how has the EPA performed as a regulator when it comes to something like Roundup?
The EPA has been astonishing in its collusion, is probably the word that works the best here. With Monsanto, the EPA, we have a memo. There's a memo that came out again through Discovery that talks about, that says the White House has Monsanto's back on glyphosate. You will not see strict regulation on glyphosate. There are many, many, many examples that date back, to the 1980s that I have found in EPA archives, that have come out through Freedom of Information documents, that have come out through litigation, that show time and time and time again, EPA works with, closely aligns with these companies that they regulate, Monsanto in particular, but also many, many others, Dow, DuPont, Syngenta, align their interests with the company's interests and put public protection of health, of the environment, second or third. And it's it's incredibly troubling and frustrating when you read about that. There's a great example in the book about this ATSDR review, this government agency that's part of Health and Human Services that wanted to do a look at glyphosate toxicity because of all the evidence that this might be causing cancer, and how Monsanto emailed EPA officials. I mean, I couldn't believe reading these emails. Monsanto emails the top guys at the Office of Pesticide Programs in EPA looking for a little assistance because they really do not want this separate agency to do a review. And within, I think it was 2 hours, these top officials are emailing and they are on it, and they are going to help Monsanto. And there are text messages back and forth. And lo and behold, they step in and they help Monsanto, and Monsanto gets the roadblock that they were looking for on this separate review.
As a result of the many, many lawsuits against Monsanto, an enormous trove of internal documents has come to light. What did they reveal?
They revealed the example I just gave you about that ATSDR review that got roadblocked. They review many aspects of reaching out to the EPA for either assistance in protecting and defending glyphosate, or sometimes telling EPA what to do. For instance, there was a document that came out that showed that when the World Health Organization's cancer experts were announcing their findings that glyphosate was a probable human carcinogen, Monsanto was sending the EPA its list of talking points. So the company was sending talking points to the EPA. There's ghostwriting that came out, a lot of documents that talk about ghostwriting, papers that would be published in the scientific literature. And that would be, the ghostwriting was Monsanto, the words of Monsanto's own scientists, but the idea was that these papers would look like they were written by people who were not affiliated with Monsanto, and they would proclaim the safety of glyphosate products, but Monsanto would actually be behind them. And there were many examples of that with glyphosate as well as with other products that Monsanto was peddling.
Right. And it's really astonishing to read about that particular action that they were taking behind the scenes, ghostwriting these papers and getting outside scientists to sign their names to it to lend credibility, and then getting it published in scientific journals. And, during this pandemic, whenever I'd hear people say, listen to the science, let the science speak, I think about your work on Monsanto. In fact, one of Monsanto's attorneys tells a jury at one point, the scientific evidence is overwhelming that glyphosate-based products do not cause cancer and did not cause Lee Johnson's cancer. It's the science that's going to answer that question for you. What has covering this company and industrial agriculture in general taught you about how science often works within a world dominated by corporate power?
Yeah, I mean, what I've learned and had my eyes open to, and is, I guess, no secret to many other people who've studied this perhaps far longer than I have, but is that, their corporate influence in science is a factor in many products that are out on the market right now and that have been on the market for a long, long time. When you talk about let's follow the science, you have to say, okay, well, whose science? I mean, are we talking about independent science that has been, reviewed by peers and, adheres to international standards for, scientific research? Or are we talking about scientific research that has been funded by and designed by these companies that are selling the products? And quite often, the science that we're being told that we should follow and we should believe, of course, is the science that was generated by the company selling the products. And why in the world people would think that, this company that has billions of dollars at stake is going to be completely unbiased in the studies and the research that it presents. And they're going to be more unbiased than this independent academic, toiling away in a university, in Italy or something. It is beyond me. I mean, it defies reason to think that the company science is going to be unbiased. And, one really frustrating, incredible example that came out through the internal documents was this study that was published in the year 2000 that sort of became the platform that Monsanto used and gave to regulators around the world to show that, not only did glyphosate and Roundup not cause cancer, but it didn't cause any reproductive problems. There was nothing at all to fear in Roundup, according to this study. And what you see in the internal documents is this whole long conversation back and forth between scientists in Monsanto about how hard they worked on that independent paper, how much time they spent, they spent 3 years working to craft this paper. And they talk about how it's going to be so great because it's going to help them defend glyphosate around the world because it's an independent paper. They appear not to even understand the hypocrisy in their own words when they talk about all the time and work that they've done on an independent paper. And they're building up public relations, PR, to help tout this paper and market this so-called independent paper. And they even talk about they've done so much work. They've got 8 scientists that really worked really hard on some papers, and they're going to print up some Roundup logo polo shirts to give to these people as a token of appreciation.
Well, is there a happy ending here? Is Monsanto going to change its practices as a result of these trials, as a result of continuing scientific inquiry, or is this just going to be tied up in appeals for the foreseeable future and they're just going to continue to sell Roundup?
Well, it's really interesting. Just yesterday, just on May 27th, Bayer issued a statement saying, you know what, we think maybe we need to change our minds. And maybe they're hinting now that they may remove Roundup products from the market in the U.S. for residential use, for lawn and garden use. They didn't say definitively that they would do that, but they seem to be leaning in that direction because they have continued to fail at coming up with a plan to head off future Roundup litigation. Even if they settle all the cases that are pending now, the company recognizes there's nothing to stop people from suing them in the future because people are going to continue to get non-Hodgkin lymphoma after using these Roundup products and continue to sue. So the most obvious answer that they have, and the judge in the federal litigation has said this to them, said this recently this month as well, why don't you just put a warning label? Put a warning label that says that this potentially could cause cancer, that IARC has said it's a probable human carcinogen, and then you're covered, or at least it's going to make it a lot harder for people to say that you didn't warn them because you have warned them. So Bayer is now starting to say, we might put something on the label. We're going to look at that. We might pull this from the residential use market. They really are in defensive mode, but they have no intention, they say, of pulling it from the agricultural market.
What about the plaintiffs? Have they seen justice? Has Lee Johnson seen any justice?
Well, from Lee's perspective, he's still dying of cancer. He has outlived his terminal diagnosis by a couple of years now, which is a remarkable thing when you see him and you see just what he's been going through. And he did finally get paid a little bit of money, not nearly the amount that the jury awarded him.
Which was what, like $250 million?
The jury in his trial awarded him $289 million. $250 million of that was in punitive damages. The trial court reduced that, and the appellate court reduced it further. There was an interesting twist. The appellate court pointed out that because Lee Johnson was expected to die very soon, he was not entitled to as much money as the jury wanted him to have. Because under California law, if you are not going to be living a long time with your suffering, then you need less money, of course, to pay for, medication and treatment and that sort of thing. So because he was expected to die so soon, his award was trimmed way down. His ultimate amount that he was owed was $20.5 million.
I mean, he has a family, right? I mean, he has children.
He has a wife and 2 children, yeah. And he, as I said, he's still hanging in there. He was also repulsed, I guess, or upset by the reduction because after 20 isn't what he netted. He then had to pay lawyers' fees and all sorts of things that come out of that before his final amount. And there have been other plaintiffs who have received money so far. as well. But there are many, many who have not, and who, as I said earlier, who have died awaiting for either their day in court or some sort of settlement. So this continues, and there looks to be maybe more trials that are coming. There are more trials on the schedule. Whether or not they will actually happen is still yet to be seen. The federal judge overseeing the litigation, Vince Shabria, has been pretty harsh against Monsanto recently and Bayer, and said that they definitely, he can see very clearly that they definitely don't want to go to trial, and they definitely want to settle because every time they get into trial they lose.
Well, as far as scientific evidence, where are we today? I know you've done stories somewhat recently about sort of new scientific work being done to study the health effects of Roundup, of glyphosate. Where are we at right now? What do we know?
There are many studies that are coming out. There have been more coming out looking at sort of the endocrine disrupting question, and if glyphosate indeed can be considered an endocrine disruptor, which is a very troubling issue if indeed it is, because it is so widely used. These EDCs, these endocrine disrupting chemicals, interfere, of course, with the hormones in the body, and interfere then, of course, with reproductive health, and can contribute to infertility and birth defects and a whole array of problems. And sadly, we have far too many of those out on the market. Chlorpyrifos is one, of course, that we can talk about, that the EPA has so staunchly defended, despite all of the evidence, that it is very damaging to children's brains, and it's disruptive to the endocrine system. DDT, again, was another one of those. We're still finding the impacts of DDT in people. But the EPA so far has not done its EDC screening on glyphosate as it was supposed to have done years ago. So you have many independent scientists saying that the evidence is mounting, that it does mess with the endocrine system, but it's far from a consensus at this point, I would say.
You've been covering the story for so long, and I'm sure it's taken a toll on you in some way. What keeps you motivated? What keeps you going?
Well, I do think, I'm a bit tired of the Monsanto saga. I wrote this latest book, the Monsanto Papers, though, because I did find the trial and the revelations that came out, and just Lee Johnson's story and the deep dive into the legal world just so compelling. I just had to write the book. I thought this is going to make a great movie one day. Hopefully it'll make a great book. So, but I'm looking at what we are doing to our world, and every time I put together a presentation and I pull the latest data, looking at childhood cancers or different diseases that we're seeing, or reproductive health, or what's going on with our insects and our bird population, what's happening to our water quality, it's a terrible story, and it's a really frighteningly sad world we're leaving for our kids. And I have 3 kids, and I really hope that they get to have kids, and that their kids get to have kids. And if you look at the data right now, it doesn't look very hopeful for them, for their future, to have a future with good health. It looks like a future with suffering and a lot of blame for the prior generations, and that's us. And so I hope that we can see the light and come together to bring a healthier world for our kids. And farmers have a big role in doing that. I mean, farmers feed us all, and that's a super important job, and we're grateful for them forever. But let's also ask our farmers to be thinking about our future generations and what they can do, and maybe practices that they can adopt that'll help make it a healthier future.
Before we say goodbye, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about the organization you work with, U.S. Right to Know. I read that site every day, but I think more people need to know about it.
Well, thank you for reading it every day. USRTK.org. We're a little tiny, very poor nonprofit, just a group of people. I'm a reporter. We have a scientist. We have a couple of public interest researchers involved. And what we do primarily is file freedom of information requests with federal agencies as well as with state agencies, and try to glean the truth about public policy, public health policy matters, so that we can then get documents and data and share them with other reporters and share them with policymakers and lawmakers and consumers. And, we spend a lot of money trying to get these documents, and court documents as well, and, discovery documents. And then we provide them all for free on our website, or as I said, or share them with reporters at very big news outlets like the New York Times and elsewhere, so that they can share them with the world. It's really just an endeavor to bring more light to, hard to find information that is really, really important to all of us, to all of our lives.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Carey.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
There you have it. Go buy the Monsanto Papers at the USA.com bookstore. Use the coupon code MAYPOD, that's MAYPOD, for 10% off on all titles. Thank you for listening to another episode of Tractor Time, brought to you by Acres USA and Barn to Door. Subscribe to our channel on YouTube, iTunes, or anywhere podcasts are available. Also find us on acresusa.com, ecofarmingdaily.com, and don't forget to subscribe to our monthly magazine. Thanks again for listening, and have a great week.